الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبا القاسم محمد. Can we have a second loud salawat for the love of Amir al-Mu'mineen? Can we have a third loud salawat for the fast reappearance of our Imam, Imam al-Mahdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajah. My dear brothers, sisters, elders, scholars, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So today I've been asked to speak about how do we build our identity and also the identity of our children. Now, every human goes through the journey of asking, who am I? Where do I belong? What is my purpose in life? And often we're too busy focusing on our own identity, our own journey, that we often neglect molding and building the identity of our children. So inshallah today I want to focus on building and molding the identity of our children, and especially focus on the early years of childhood and what we as parents can do to build and ensure that our children have a strong identity. Now, some may question and say, why is it important to have a strong identity? Now, there's numerous studies that talk about the advantages of having a strong identity. They say that an individual that knows where they belong, where they came from, and has a strong identity, they are more confident. They have a good self-esteem. So studies have shown that identity, having a strong identity, is linked to good mental health as well. So if you know where you belong, if you know where you came from, then you are fulfilled as an adult, and you are more likely to be successful, and rather than being confused. Now, in today's discussion, I want to focus on the methods that we can employ to ensure that our children have a strong identity, that grow up understanding who they are, where they came from, and in order for them to be successful. But before I speak about the methods that we could do to ensure our children have a strong identity, I want to mention two case studies which really show us the impact that early childhood has on children. Now, these two case studies are extreme case studies, but they truly highlight the vulnerability of children and how the interactions, the surroundings, and the society that the children grow up in has an impact on them. The first case study took place in 1931. Now, this was by a couple. They were both psychologists, and the father was a psychologist. So what he done, and the experiment that he wanted to do, is that he adopted a chimpanzee. The chimpanzee was 7.5 months old, and he had his own son, who was called Donald, his son, who was 10 months old. Now, in his experiment, he wanted to highlight that if you raise a chimpanzee with humans, the chimpanzee will eventually adapt and behave like a human being. So what he done is that he practically raised them as siblings. They would eat together, they would sleep together, they would play together. They interacted and spent the majority of their time together. Now, to his surprise, rather than the chimpanzee beginning to behave like a human being, his son began to behave like a chimpanzee. He started to mimic a chimpanzee, he started to make noises as if he was a chimpanzee, and he started to even mimic his mannerism. Now, to such an extent that he had to end the experiment 9 months in, and he gave up the chimpanzee because he was concerned that it was affecting his son negatively. This really did highlight the vulnerability of children, even to that extreme, that their society, whatever they see from a young age, they will begin to mimic. Whether it's language, whether it's mannerism, whether it's their behavior, whether it's the way they act, they will absorb everything that they witness at a young age. There's another extreme case study that many of you may have heard because it was plastered on all the British tabloids, and Channel 4 done a documentary on it. And if you search online, you'll see so many documentaries on this second case study. And this was of a girl called Oksana Malaya. She was born in Ukraine. Now, her medical records at the time of birth, suggested that there was no medical issues at the time of birth. She was absolutely normal. Her parents were alcoholics, so they neglected their children. This young girl left the house, and she went, and then she was raised, and she lived with dogs. So there were wild dogs, and she was raised and lived with them. The authorities in Ukraine discovered her at the age of 7.5 months old. So she had lived around 7 years with dogs. When they found her, she didn't know how to walk like a human being. She would walk on all fours. She would bark. Her bark was, you cannot tell the difference between a dog barking and her barking. That was her form of communication. She had absolutely no words. She didn't know how to communicate like a human being. She was behaving like a dog. The way she eats was like a dog. She identified herself as a dog. Now, this is an extreme scenario, but that shows us that every society that we live in, we will begin to identify ourselves with those who surround us. If we, whether it's language, whether it's the way we act, the way we behave, the way we even interact, this is what will happen. So afterwards, it took many, many years of therapy and many years to even get her to walk like a human being and then eventually speak like a human being. So that really shows us the vulnerability of children, and we have to be aware of what our children are doing, who's interacting with our children. How are they spending their hours, their days, their time? What are they viewing? This is very important. Now, Imam Ali alayhi salam has said that the hearts of the youngsters are like uncultivated grounds. So whatever you throw at it, it will accept. Now, when we're raising our own children, we have to understand that they're like a sponge. So whatever you give them, they will absorb. So we have to be very cautious of what they are doing at a very young age and our participation in their lives. Now, I just want to mention some points about what we can do, the methods that we can implement, the methods that we can employ to ensure that our children grow up with a strong identity, grow up as fulfilled adults, grow up as good human beings, shall we say. The first, I would say, is there are many methods I can say, but there's one point that I want to mention, because this happened recently. One of my good friends, and I told her I'm going to mention this, one of my good friends, she's expecting a baby boy, and she told me that she's going to name her son Adam. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I love the name Adam. But it's the compensation that followed that was a bit alarming. She said, yeah, I want to call him Adam because I want him to have an easy life. I don't want to call him Muhammad, for example, because, you know, the society, the political climate, I don't want him to be discriminated against. Now, I said, what's wrong with the name Muhammad? I mean, we have many ahadith which talk about the benefits of calling our sons after the Prophet. But there is this mentality, and she said, you know, we have articles, there's an article that says that people that are called Muhammad, they were paid more higher car insurance, there was this, there was that. So what we find is that in our society, and many people that are bringing up children, they would give them a name which sounds more Western, and they would neglect the religious names because they want the child to have an easy name. Or for example, someone calling their son Ja'far, but writing it as Jeffrey, for example. So that, by the way, this is a real person done that. Just so that it's easier to mention, easier to pronounce. Now, this is very alarming. There's nothing wrong with Western names. They're beautiful. But we should not neglect our religious names. We have some amazing Islamic personalities in Islamic history that were absolutely amazing that we need to name after. And I didn't really recognize the importance of naming a child after these personalities until I went to Iraq. Now, I took my two sons to Iraq when they were very, very young. The first trip that we took them, one was 2, one was 4. And I remember me and my husband, we stood Bain al-Haramain, and we, told one son, we said, this is the shrine of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And he said, is that my shrine? Because his name was Hussein. And we said, yeah, we named you after Hussein. And then we turned to the other side and we said, this is the shrine of Abu Fadl al-Abbas. Now, Abbas, my son, was 2 years old. He started jumping up and down. And he said, that's my shrine. And that shows us that if you name your child after these personalities, they will always have a link. They will have a connection to Islam and have a connection with these personalities. And we have a numerous hadith that say that it is the responsibility, the first responsibility of parents to give their child a good name, So that is one of the main responsibilities. Number 2, and it's neglect. Now, when you talk about child neglect, you think about neglect in terms of the essentials in life, of food, neglecting your children of food, neglecting your children of a clean and safe environment, for example, neglecting your children of being clean and hygiene. But there is another form of neglect that I think a lot of parents do and do not realize, and that is the neglect of intelligence. A lot of parents, unfortunately, the kids go to school majority of the day, they come home, the parents have just come from work, tired. It will be good if they look at each other's faces and have a conversation for 20 minutes. That sometimes doesn't happen. And you know what gets in the way? These little screens that we have. A lot of us will look at these telephone screens, television screens, iPad screens, more than we look at the face of our own children. And they do not communicate with our children. This is a form of neglect. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that knowledge in early childhood is as if you're engraving into stone. Imagine the impact that the knowledge you give your children, just having a conversation, having a discussion for just 10, 20 minutes with your children will be engraved within them, will stay with them for the rest of their life. So we have to ensure that we're not neglecting our children of time. We have to ensure there's no point having babies and then just leaving them and throwing screens at them. There's children that are 2, 3, 4 years old that will sit hours in front of the iPad, and I need to continue, but just mentioning a few points, and that will flick through the iPad, and that is a form of neglect. We have to make sure that we set a time as a family to put the phones away, to put the computer screens away, to put the iPads away, and to focus on our children. Another thing, I studied media in university and studied media for many years, and I understand the impact that media has on our children. Media is so powerful. I've done a whole module which just focused on how media affects individuals. Now, do we know what our children are viewing? Do we know what our children are listening to? There are teenagers that lock themselves up in the room. God knows what they're looking at. God knows what they're listening to. And this is all affecting them. This is all molding their identity. And I want to mention one point, and this is no way an attack on anyone, but the hijab, for example. There are many sisters which are wearing the turban. Now, this is not a discussion whether the turban is hijab or not. This is not a religious discussion. But if it wasn't for social media, if it wasn't for Instagram or YouTube, let's be frank, many of those that wear the turban will say that they got influenced by social media, by YouTube, by Instagram. As I said, this is not a religious discussion of whether it's hijab or not. But the fact is that it could also change our perspective on how we view religion, our religious views. What is hijab? What is Islam? What it is to be a Muslim? And last point, just before I end off, actions speak louder than words. Parents have to understand that you can tell your child, you're a Muslim, you're this, you're that, you're that. They will mimic your actions. And we have to ensure that we are behaving in a certain way in front of our children the way that we want. And lastly, to end off, we can plant the seeds, but we need to ensure that we cultivate those seeds, watering it, ensure that there's enough sunshine. So no matter what age your children become, you still have a responsibility as parents, we still have a responsibility as parents to ensure that we are constantly strengthening their identity, we are constantly supporting them, we are constantly that support system for them. Thank you so much for listening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.